welcome everyone, and welcome to this slightly delayed session at CogX Live. I'm Azeem Azhar. I'm the founder of Exponential View, amongst other things, and I want to get straight into the discussion with our guest today because he is a fascinating character with some remarkable research, a very counterintuitive way of looking at a major scientific conundrum. I'm really delighted to have Jeff Hawkins here today. He is the co-founder of Numenta. It's a neuroscience research company and the founder of the Redwood Neuroscience Institute. And he was one of the founders of the field of handheld computing, something, of course, now that nearly 6 billion of us around the world use every day. And today we're going to be talking about Jeff's new ideas on intelligence. Jeff, welcome to CogX 2021.
Thanks, Azeem. It's great to be here, or be there virtually. Yeah.
Yes, well, you are here. I trust that that's you, and you're not giving us a simulacrum that you've been able to spirit up with your research. Is that the real Jeff Hawkins I'm talking to?
This is the real, but how would you know? But yes,
how would either of us know? Exactly. Jeff, you've been working on intelligence for many, many years. You have a 2005 book, which was read very, very widely, created a real stir when it came out. It was called On Intelligence, and it developed the idea of human intelligence as a kind of memory prediction system. You've got a new book, which I confess I own. This is my own copy that I'm going to hold up, 1,000 Brains. And it was the first book I bought after I finished writing the manuscript of mine. And your book develops and expands on a lot of that material. So let's start at the beginning of this journey, really. We need some context on the great task that you've embarked on. What do you mean by intelligence, and why has it been such a fiendish phenomenon for philosophers and neuroscientists and cognitive scientists to explain?
Well, my interest started with the brain. We all have a brain, and I figured, like, well, we should understand how it works. And when I was young, I realized that we didn't understand how it works. I'm hearing an echo, by the way. Does anyone else hear that echo?
No, we don't have an echo. Yeah.
Okay, because I have two of me on the screen here, so I'll just keep going and ignore myself. So I fell in love with the idea that we could figure out how the brain works in my lifetime, and decided to dedicate my career to that, really. And so that was the number one thing. And then I also realized if we figured out how the brain works, we would likely learn stuff that would help us figure out how to make truly intelligent machines. And so it's just like I couldn't think of anything more important to work on in my life. So that's where the fascination comes from. And then the reason I wrote this new book is because in the last 5 years, we made huge progress in understanding exactly how the neocortex works. We kind of cracked the code on this. And so it has a lot of implications for AI and for society. And I think it's just an interesting story to tell. People should know how their brain works. So that's kind of.
I mean, the brain is of course an amazing thing. I think you were motivated at some point by a paper that Francis Crick, who was one of the discoverers of DNA, wrote back in the late 70s, talking about all of the things that we didn't know about this brain that we all carry with us. We all, as you say, we all rightly have one. What's been difficult for a general viewer to understand? What's been difficult about us making sense of the brain? We've made sense of so many other complicated things.
Yeah, I think if you try to why is it taking so long to figure out how this thing works? Is unlike a heart, you can say, oh, it's like a pump, and there's muscle cells, and neural muscle cells, right? The brain is made of billions of neurons, and to understand how it works, you can't look at it as a mass effect. You have to look at the individual neurons as they're firing on and off in real time, very fast, in very specific patterns. And that was impossible to record. These cells are teeny, and you have to look at thousands of them active at the same time to figure out what they're doing. And so it's been very, very technically challenging to peel apart the brain and see how it's acting in real time. So I think that would be the number one obstacle. The other thing is that humans have we think we know what it means to be intelligent. It goes, oh yeah, I can know it. I see. I can look and see things. I know what that is, but you don't. Actually, you have no idea how you're doing that. And so our intuitions can be very misleading about what's going on. And almost all neuroscientists eventually discover that. They eventually figure out, like, oh, it's nothing like we think it is. So those two things, I think, technical difficulties and our intuitions have made it very, very difficult. But lately, there's been some great experimental data that we've really developed these techniques, and we have made tremendous progress. And that's why I wrote this book. We're theorists, and so we look at all this research, these empirical results, and then through a combination of things I described in the book, we're able to figure out how the neocortex is basically working. So
let's understand the neocortex. Why is it the key to human intelligence?
Yeah, well, it's the largest part of the human brain. It's almost 3/4 of the volume of our brain. And it's associated with everything we think about intelligence, whether it's vision, hearing, touch, language, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, literature, music. It's all created by the neocortex. And the amazing thing about the neocortex is it's extremely uniform structure. It's like a sheet, a dinner napkin, and it's like 3 inches thick. And everywhere you look, it looks identical. It has very similar structure.
Right.
And so it was figured out a long time ago it's going to work on some common algorithm. Everything we think about intelligence is on this some kind of common algorithm.
Right.
And so it gives us a target to shoot for.
So let's do this. We've got a great audience out there, and I'm going to predict that most of them are not neuroscientists. So we're going to have to do some basic 101 neuroanatomy and brain geography. So there are 3 parts to the brain. You've talked to us about the neocortex. It's about 3 millimeters thick, and it's like a wrinkled dinner napkin. What other bits of the brain are there? And you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to ask some very basic questions for the next few minutes.
It's okay. So you can think of the neocortex as like one thing. It's like one part, one organ. And then there are dozens of other organs in the brain. They're much smaller. And so they do all kinds of different things. So there's some that are regulating our heart rate, digestion, and they make our emotions, they create sex. There's all these other things we do. Our emotional states, our biological maintenance, and even things like moving your limbs. There's parts of the brain, all the parts of the brain that make it smooth, cerebellum, and so on. But you can isolate the neocortex. It's sort of this thing that appeared fairly recently in evolutionary time, and it got really big fairly recently. And so you can understand what it does, somewhat independent of most of the other parts of the brain. Not completely.
Yeah.
But the way I like to think about it in a very simplistic way is the neocortex is sort of this rational model of the world. What it does, jumping ahead, it creates a model of the world.
But the neocortex... Yeah, the neocortex is the wrinkly gray bit.
Yes.
It's the wrinkly...
It's like a sheet that's wrapped around the rest of the brain. And
right.
Just to fit in the head.
Okay, and again, just for the... Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Go, please.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Think about this big sheet, and it's about 1,500 square centimeters, 3 millimeters thick. But it's divided into what they call columns. A column is like a skinny piece of spaghetti. They're stacked next to each other, about 3 millimeters long. And in our human brain, there's about 150,000 of them. So it's composed of this, and it's viewed as a repetitive unit. There's 150,000 units of doing something similar that comprise this big sheet. And if you can figure out what that unit does, this cortical column, you can figure out how the whole thing works, because it turns out that the columns do language, they do vision, they do hearing. It's a very surprising thing. So
each, I'll play that back to you. Each column is a sort of entity in of itself, and there are 150,000 of them, which doesn't sound like much, except that when we think about the brain and its tens of billions of neurons and the trillions of connections between them, is actually quite a small number, right? It's quite a tractable number at 150,000.
Well, you could argue it's a small number, but if you think about each of those columns has about 100,000 neurons. Each neuron may have 5,000 synapses, so there might be 500 million synapses in a column. There are several kilometers of wiring in every column and 100,000 neurons. So this is a very complex unit. It's not like these are simple units. they have a very complex architecture. So each column, what we figured out, each column is doing something very sophisticated. So yes, there's only 150,000 of them, which is, you could argue about that many, but I would argue quite a bit. But each one is actually a very complex processor.
Right.
And that's the theory of the thousand brain comes about, because what we learned is that each of these columns is doing a complete modeling system, sensory motor modeling system. It's basically modeling the world on its own, and then communicate to
I'm going to get to the theory in a second. I just want to give one last clarification around this, which is,
Sure.
how do we know they're there, and why did we only find out they were there when we did?
Well, the interesting thing about them is you can't see them under a microscope. There's another structure you can see called a mini column, but we won't talk about that. But the columns I'm talking about, you can't see under a microscope. And it was a famous neuroscientist, Bernie Mountcastle, who made the argument over decades why they're there. And here's the basic answer. If you look at the tissue in the neocortex, it looks very similar everywhere. It's a very complex structure. But about a millimeter of it, if you take a millimeter area of a column, those neurons all process input from someplace, like one patch of your skin. And then the next column over processes input from a different patch of skin. And the next column over processes it from a different patch of skin. Same with your eyes. Your eyes, the retina is actually, there's thousands of columns that are looking at each little patch of the retina. No one looks at the whole thing. So there's a visual column that looks at just a little patch, and the next column looks at another patch. And so it's just, there's this very clear demarcation between what these inputs are to these things, and that's what defines the column.
Right.
But there's tremendous evidence.
And so you've called this the thousand brains theory, that is essentially referring to these columns. But round out the theory for us. What is the thousand brains theory?
So this is, you mentioned, it gets a little complicated, but I'll try to make it simple. Each column, the trick was to figure out what's going on inside these columns, because that's the key to unraveling the whole thing. And what we learned, and I won't go through how we learned this yet, but what we learned is that every column is getting some sort of input, like you think from a sensor. Every column has some sort of motor output. Every column is trying to move that sensor. So the parts of the brain that are getting input from your finger are trying to move the finger. And the parts of the brain that get it from the eye are moving that. And we learned that each column is learning a model of its input based on movement. And the trick to understanding that is they maintain these internal reference frames. It's like, if I want to learn I use this example of a coffee cup in the book. You can learn what a coffee cup feels like. It's shaped by moving your finger and touching it as you move. And the brain, each column is keeping track of where your finger is in this reference frame of the cup, and it can build a 3D model of the cup. So every column in your brain, all 150,000, are building these literal models of the things you're seeing and feeling and hearing, and they use reference frames in movement to do this.
Right.
This is new. This was not really understood 5 years ago, and so now the whole thing falls into place. We understand how it is we build models of the world in our head.
Right. So there's a couple of phrases you used there that I think we should also unpack again. The first was model, and the second was reference frame. So what do you mean by a model?
To understand the world, like you look out at the world and see something, or you hear something, or you touch something, your brain has to recreate that thing in your head. It's literally like you can think of it like a physical model. Like, okay, I have a little model of a coffee cup in my head, but it's not done like that. Of course, it's more like a computer model, like a CAD model, computer automated design. Literally, it has to, somehow the neurons have to represent the structure of things. If I know what a coffee cup is, the neurons in each column that can recognize that coffee cup need to represent the physical structure of the coffee cup. And therefore you can, when you have a model, you can imagine what it looks like from different directions, or what it would feel like if you rotated, or what would happen if you interact with it. So to understand the world in general, you have to have a model of the world. And to predict what's going to happen, you have to have a model of the world. And to plan future actions to achieve goals, you have to have a model of the world.
And every one of those cortical columns has a model has all the models that we play around with?
No, not everything. So here's the interesting thing about it. What we learned is that, of course, if I have a column that's getting into my finger, it can learn models of things I can touch. But it wouldn't know about color. It wouldn't know about sound, but it could know what a coffee cup feels like, and
right,
what shape is. The models in my visual cortex can learn what the shape of the object is too, like the coffee cup, but it won't know the textures, but it'll know the colors. And there'll be models in my auditory cortex that know like what does things sound like when I place them on the table and so on. And,
Okay.
So these are complementary models. So the idea of the 1,000 brains model is that when I ask this stuff like, where is something like a coffee cup stored in your head? It's actually stored not in every column, but in thousands of columns, and those columns are not identical. The models are complementary. There are many different types of models of the same object.
Right.
And now so you have these. If I say where is the coffee cup stored? It's in thousands of separate models.
So I'm gonna rely now on a few of the models in your brain to explain to us what a reference frame is. So bring them all together. What's a reference frame?
A reference frame is just a way of structuring information. You can think about when you went to high school and you learn about the like XYZ coordinate system, like the Cartesian coordinates, and you say, where is this point in space? And so, well, I can specify the 3 points, right? 3 numbers. It's just like that. The neurons do something very similar to that. They do differently, but something similar.
Right.
And so when you have information, it's not just stored in a list in your brain. It's like, oh, here's the facts about bicycles, or here's the facts about dogs. It has to store them in some sort of structure. And what it does, it creates a reference frame, like an X, Y, and Z coordinate, but not something like that. And then the information is stored at locations in this reference frame. So that's how we build computer models, like a house, for example. Mm-hmm. That's how the brain does it too. And so the reference frame gives structure to knowledge. And this is what's missing in AI, by the way. AI today has no reference frame. There's no structure to data. It does not represent 3-dimensional shapes or the dimensionality of information.
Right.
It's very flat. And but the world is structured, and knowledge is structured. And to act on knowledge, you have to have a reference frame.
Now,
we didn't understand this 5 years ago.
Right. Now, what you don't know is that we are sitting physically. I am sitting 400 yards away from the headquarters of DeepMind, globally. One of the AI researchers, leading researchers. So we will talk about AI in a second. But I just want to finish up on your theory here. So we've got this idea of a cup from a range of our different cortical columns, but there is only one cup, and I know how to manipulate only one cup. So how does that these different mini machines, complex machines with 500 million connections each within them, come together to give me a single view of the world that I can manipulate?
That's been a mystery for a long time, and it goes by a number of names. The most common name is the binding problem, it's a general problem, like, oh, you have all these different sensors, and where do they get united into some common percept, right? And when we look at the brain, you don't see all this information come together to one point. It's distributed all over the place, and it doesn't look like it comes together, and that's why it's called the binding problem. Where is it bound together? What we've discovered is that these thousands of models, they have these long-range connections, neurons that go between them, that they use to vote. And they're constantly voting on what they're thinking. It's like, one finger says, I might be touching these 3 objects. And another finger says, I might be touching these 3 objects. And they send a signal between them and says, the only thing that's consistent with what we're all experiencing is the coffee cup or whatever it is. And that is the only thing you perceive. You perceive the stable, like, oh yes, there's this cup in front of me. You don't actually even know that your eyes are moving or that your fingers are moving around the cup. You just say, oh, the cup is stable. Yeah. There it is, the cup. That's because you only perceive the voting of these neurons. And that's where it comes together. This sort of global consensus about, hey, this is the thing that's happening.
And how do you have any idea how that voting process works? I mean, is it a little bit like censuring a president where you need 60% of the neurons, not 51% of the neurons, like in the Senate? Is it a unanimous system? Is it a weighted average system? How does the voting actually work?
Well, yeah, in our scientific papers, we describe this, we do simulations of this, so we're not just making this up. We tested this. It's a bit like voting, where you have to reach a consensus. You can't perceive 2 things at once. The brain doesn't want to say, oh, it could be a cup, it could be a can. There's some famous images like a vase and a face, and you can't perceive them at the same time. It's either going to look like a vase or it's going to look like a face, but you can't see both at the same time. So the system's going to come to an agreement, and it's going to say, oh, and it's kind of like, you can think of it like majority voting. The most evidence we have, it's going to say, okay, majority wins, that's it. Everybody else is silenced for now. and we're going to go with that hypothesis.
But I'm curious.
It's easy to show how neurons do this.
Do you think that? I mean, when you say that, it makes me wonder about certain types of neurological conditions where people may misperceive things. Do you think that could? What does your theory tell us about what the origins of those sorts of conditions might be, whether it is something like a synesthesia or aphasia or other types of issues that people deal with?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I should say that we do not study diseases or aberrations of the brain in any way. We try to understand how healthy brains work, but clearly these kind of questions come up, right? You can start thinking about them. I think it would be, given it's not my expertise, I won't say I'm an expert on synesthesia, for example. I don't want to venture too much, but I think there are a lot of implications for the theory in terms of various sort of psychological and psychiatric issues, perhaps. Not all. I mean, there's a lot of diseases of the brain that have nothing to do with those. But there's some where you misperceive things, or you might hear voices in your head, or you don't perceive the world the way other people do.
Right.
That could be. But I think that I'll be getting off my expertise.
Okay, well then we'll move back to your expertise. So one of the things, when you talk to me about the voting across these different columns and the way this consensus emerges, it made me think of a technique from machine learning called ensemble learning or ensemble learning, depending on which part of the world you're from. The idea is that you may have a whole bunch of different subsystems trying to make some prediction, and you actually get better performance if you ensemble them together. And
yeah, it's kind of like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit, but it's only kind of like that. And it's very, your theory is a very distinct way of thinking about how intelligence emerges relative to the world of AI today. What would you say are the key distinctions between, the Numenta view of how you create intelligence and how that's emerged, and the typical AI view that we see?
Well, can I give some background on that first?
Please, yeah.
Okay, so I think today's AI is amazing. There's some amazing capabilities that have been done in the last 10 years or so, and it's very valuable. But most people who study AI, would agree that it's not really intelligent. It's got its real limitations. It doesn't generalize. It doesn't have any motor behavior. You can't ask any AI agent to go make some coffee, and by the way, if the filter gets stuck, it'll figure out how to fix it. I mean, we're so far from that, right? So there's a general agreement that today's AI is not really intelligent. Now, the only question is how do we get to true machine intelligence? We might get there by engineering and thinking and experimentation with existing AI systems. You might get there by studying the brain. It's really, the question it really is what's the quickest way to get there? And there's a legitimate debate about that. I've always felt that studying the brain would be the most likely way to get there sooner, even though it's taken me 40 years to get to this point. It's a long journey. I think it's true. AI's been around for 70 years or so, and we still are not creating truly intelligent machines. So now the only question is how do we get there from here? And now that I understand how the brain works, I can say very conclusively or very strongly what's going to be required. And in the second section of my book, I talk about this at length. But a few things are going to be very important. First, we have to understand that intelligence requires, whether it's machine or human intelligence, requires this very complicated model of the world and how the world works. You have to recreate the world in your machine, in your head. And then you have to say, well, what are the ways you could do that? And it becomes very clear to me now, it wasn't clear earlier, but it's very clear now, that you have to have some sort of what we would call a metric space, which is a reference frame. You have to have some way of organizing knowledge about the world that lets you act on it. It says, oh, what would happen if I did this? And what would happen if I did this? And if I moved over here or morphed this thing, what would it look like? And you need structure. You need a reference frame to do that. And most AI today has nothing like that at all. It has nothing like a reference frame in them. And they're not distributed in the way we just described in 1,000 thing. I think if I were to give the several things you have to do, the intelligent machine has to have ability to move, it has to have some sort of sensors, has to have ability to move those sensors, some sort of embodiment. It has to be able to organize that information in a structured way, which would be a reference frame. Those are the key elements. And it gives us a very clear roadmap of how to get there. We want to know how the brain does this.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, we look at the 60 or so year history of AI. There have been these two different approaches, one of which has attempted to create formalized reference frames, right? We call it kind of the semantic approach, and Doug Lennart at UIC spent 25, 30 years trying to encode knowledge in this way. And we actually have discovered, at least in an industrial approaches, like industrial scenarios, we've been able to build tools that don't require that reference frame. And of course that's why we have natural language generators like GPT-3, or we can do machine vision at high capability. Why do you not get unstuck in your approach when you're applying reference frames, when previous researchers looking at the question of artificial knowledge and artificial knowledge representation did get unstuck as they tried to build, or did get stuck, right, as they tried to build these systems?
That's right. The history that has these parallel tracks of people trying to do more semantic representation. The problem in the past was that they were engineered by humans. The mechanism were engineered, and B, the data was engineered. It was like intent. What we now understand is that the whole system learns by movement. You can't just program in the data. You have to discover the data through movement, and that's how humans learn. That's how animals learn. And so the idea, just like early neural networks failed too, until they figured out use more data and
faster processors and all of that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So that was the idea of semantic representation is not wrong either. In fact, it's essential, and people argued that, and they were right. Now, but we just didn't do it right. Right? We didn't. The way it's done matters, and we didn't know how to do it back then, and so it matters. Now, today's networks are really powerful, but I'll argue, even like GPT-3, which is a language AI system, which does amazing stuff, it's also very brittle, and it's very limited. It's a statistical approach that is really good for certain things, and the same is true with image recognition software.
Yeah,
they're very brittle. They don't really. If you say, okay, here I'm going to teach the system to recognize pictures of cats, and it's getting 99% of the time cats. Well, it's easy to break it. It's very easy to show something that's clearly a cat and it thinks it's something else. And not only that, you say, okay, well, tell me, do cats have livers? Do they have lungs? What does the underside of a cat look like?
Oh, you can have tons of fun. You can have tons of fun with those networks. I'm not sure you'd necessarily want to apply them anywhere. So, I'm curious about this.
Humans can do those things.
Humans can do, yeah. Of course. Now, I'm curious about what you say is the importance of movement and motion. So that suggests somebody hearing that in order to build a real, really intelligent system in the way that we understand intelligence, we're going to need to embody this and have this thing kind of roaming around the street and learning like a metallic toddler.
Not true. I was very careful with my words earlier. I said you have to have a sensory system, and it has to be able to move the sensor.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a robot walking down the street. I think we're actually not going to have any of those.
Right.
But there's lots of physical embodiments that don't look like that at all. A car has a physical embodiment and moves about, so you don't think that is like some dangerous sci-fi or.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also have virtual movement. So, for example, the internet has structure. It has servers and sites, and they're connected together in a very complex manner, and there's web pages and so on. Well, you could move through the internet by having a sensor, which is basically reading text and information off web pages. And the movements would be following links or other things like that. And so that system could learn the structure of a website or the internet without physically having an embodiment, but adhering to the behaviors or the tenets of embodiment. So it doesn't, I think we should get rid of this idea that, some Terminator type things roaming the streets. It's just not going to be that.
So what, you in your previous career, before you were a neuroscience researcher, you were an engineer building and shipping products. What are the type, when do you think industry may ship, I'm going to use the word product, I don't mean it that way, but ship things that do things that are built from the theory that is the reference designs that your theory creates?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and it's very hard to know, right? It's very hard to know quickly. First of all, how many people will be sold on this idea? How many people will adopt it and work on it? One of the reasons I wrote the book is to attract researchers to think about it this way, and so far I'm finding it's working. And then there's a question of how long it will take. I think, a good analogy would be computing in the 1940s. In the 1940s, Alan Turing and John von Neumann and others were basically discovering the principles of what it means to compute. What is an algorithm? What is a compute? They didn't know how to build computers. They had no transistors or semiconductors or anything like that. No software, but they had the principles, these underlying principles. And then you can see how the whole tech industry evolved, the computing industry evolved from that going over decades. We're sort of in a similar situation. We've kind of discovered the basic principles underlying what intelligence is, and I'm making that case in my book. And how quickly will it play out? How quickly will we reach the 1950s of computers, and the 1980s of computers, and the 2020s of computers? I think it's going to happen a lot quicker now, because we're starting with this huge technological base. We have many, many computers and semiconductors and people building special hardware and so on. If I had to guess, and it would be just a guess, Azeem, I would say 10 years from now that the principles that I lay out in 1,000 Brains will be a major part of AI. And my team is working to make that stuff. Even if no one else does it, we are well on the path to doing that. But I think there'll be a lot of other people who adopt the ideas as well.
Right. So I want to come back to a couple of those observations. So one is that you've taken inspiration from, well, more than inspiration, you've built your theory from coming up with a theory of how the human brain works. And it struck me as I read the ideas that, of course, we have machines that do things that things from the animal kingdom do, like planes that fly. But our planes don't fly like birds. They don't flap their wings. They're propelled by jet engines or propellers. Is there a sort of a theoretical error in trying to essentially build a replica of the mechanisms that work in here, or maybe not in here, but in your head, and in the same way that you try, you don't build a plane by studying a crow?
Yeah, well, two things. I'll need to correct you on that.
Okay, I'm ready. I said there's not much in here.
The Wright brothers studied birds. They had birds. They used birds in wind tunnels. They absolutely, and the innovation that the Wright brothers made was not the propeller. The innovation, the challenge of flight was controlled flight. How do you turn an airplane? The people knew how to make an airplane go straight. They didn't have to make an airplane turn. So the Wright brothers' problem was how to turn. And it wasn't just the rudder turns and then plane falls out of the sky. What they learned is that the birds twist their wings. And that's what they did. They made a plane where they twisted the wings. And we still do this today. We don't twist the entire wing. We just twist the tail end of the wing, the little flaps that go on. That was the Wright brothers' discovery. That was the innovation, and that came from birds. So that analogy is just wrong, because birds are still influencing how planes fly. Now, clearly, we don't need to make brains. We don't need to make AI systems out of biological neurons. We don't have to copy everything in the brain. We don't have to do that, just like we don't have to make airplanes flap the wings. But we don't, up to now, we don't know what to do. We don't know what the right thing is. How do we make a machine intelligent? And the Wright brothers said, we don't know how to make a plane turn. And so you study the biological system first, you learn what it is, and then you say, okay, that's how the biology does it. I now understand the principles. How am I going to implement them someplace else? And so I'll argue that it's possible that AI scientists could have figured this out a long time ago without studying brains. It's quite possible.
Right.
They didn't. And it turns out it's really complicated. I don't think they would have, because now it took us many years to figure this out.
Sure.
But now that we know it's not that hard, and we can build it in different ways. We can build it in silicon. We don't have to copy everything the brain does at all. But these principles we talked about earlier, the reference frames and the sensory motor embodiment, those are essential.
But in a sense, for any technology that comes out, you also have to think about the ecosystem that surrounds it, and you have to think about how it makes its way into the market. When I was a sort of a preteen, my next door neighbor swore blind that Betamax was technically superior to VHS, and he may well have been right. Now, millions of data scientists and programmers know how to use these statistical neural networks, these techniques like deep learning or reinforcement learning or Bayesian systems. How do you shift them, right? And how do you shift that lock-in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's the approach we're taking. We have a bunch of principles we've learned from the brain, and some of them we haven't talked about. So these are important. And you can apply those principles to existing artificial neural networks. And we've been doing that over the last 2 years. So, for example, one of the principles that the brain works on is sparsity. It turns out that in brains, only a small percentage, 1 to 2% of the neurons are active at any point in time. Most of them are not active at any point in time. That's not the way artificial neural networks work today, where almost all the units are active all the time.
Right.
So we've shown that by introducing sparsity to existing neural networks, existing problems, we can make them run up to 100 times faster, meaning 100 times less energy. And we can also, which is a huge benefit. It's like, it doesn't take a great shift. If someone's spending $1 million a year, on compute time, you can bring that down to, let's say, $1,000, or $10,000 a year or something. It's like, okay, I'm going to do that. The other problem with existing neural networks is they're very difficult to train. So although they work really well, they're very hard to train. You have to train them for very long periods of time on millions of pieces of labeled data, basically. And that's not how humans learn. But it's very expensive to do this, and you can't take an existing neural network and say, you know what, I want to add one more thing. You can't do that. You got to start all over.
Yeah.
But we know how to do that using something called dendritic processing, and we're trying to implement that now. And so, if we can show that we can make existing neural networks so they don't forget when you train them on something new, that's commercially valuable today. So That's our approach. Our approach is to start off with let's try these other things. We don't have to do the whole theory. Start with sparsity and dendritic things, and we can add reference frames later. And we can make existing networks much, much better.
Right. Jeff, you're using words that are well above my pay grade, like sparsity and dendritic. So fortunately, in our last 4 or 5 minutes, we've got some super smart people who have been firing up their cortical columns with some questions. And I'm just going to read a couple of them out, and I'm going to pretend that I know what I'm saying. From Sasha, how does 1,000 brains compare to the active inference free energy framework? I mean, what other plausible alternative hypotheses are there?
That is a really complicated question. And honestly, I don't want to answer that here. We would use all 4 minutes plus more. And look, there are many competing ideas about how you might go about creating truly intelligent machines. There are other people trying to think like, okay, enough of this artificial neural networks. What else should we do, right? And I think it's a marketplace of ideas. And so the question is, as you said earlier, how do we move the needle? How do we get people to pay attention to this? I think what we should do is we should explore all these ideas. I'm not against other ideas at all. I think we should explore all of them. But the proof comes in the pudding, right? Like, okay, can you make these things more robust? Can you make them faster? Can you make them do new things you haven't done before? And there's a laundry list of other ideas that people have had. We could go talk about all of them.
Yeah, we can. And yeah, go ahead.
I think the free energy principle is a complicated one. I'm not an expert in it, but I get the basic ideas of it. And I think it's a very challenging one to talk about in the conference.
Okay, we have some more technical questions, which I'm going to tell you land in the same zone. So I'm going to ask a slightly different question because we're coming short of time, which is that you've studied human brains and you've come up with a theory. But we're not the only intelligence of capability on this planet. I think about octopuses, and they're likely to be other forms of intelligence, or either now or have been historically elsewhere in the universe. How do you think those might operate, and what might that mean in terms of the way that they think about their status, their situation, their model of the world?
So that's really interesting, and some fascinating recent results on this. So I've argued okay, it's all about movement of sensors, sensory body embodiment, and these reference frames, right? And in the cortex, they're structured in a certain way. But there's now increasing evidence. Take birds. Birds are pretty smart too. That they have similar structures. They're just not organized in the same way. That blurbs have these things called blobs. Literally, that's what they're called. but it looks like internally they might be doing the exact same operation as the cortex is doing. The same with octopus. So I'd say the following. I'll go to my deathbed on this. If you're going to have an intelligent system, I don't care if it's an alien from planet Xenon, whatever, or an octopus, they have to have a model of the world in their head. That's a given. You cannot be intelligent without having a model of some part of the world in your head or in your system. That model is going to be built on reference training, and it's going to be learned through movement. I will state those. I think those are absolute bedrock requirements, and so you'll find that in birds, you'll find that in octopuses. Now, something like a spider, you say, wow, a spider builds these spider webs, they're really, really complicated. But I don't know if the spider's intelligent. I don't know if the spider has any idea what his web looks like, and it just might be following some algorithm, right? So not everything that produces some sort of intricate behavior has to be intelligent. But there's a lot of animals that are intelligent, a huge number. And I think, by the way, I think other mammals like dolphins and whales and things like that, they're smart, they're intelligent, they're conscious, they know exactly what's going on. I don't think they're really any different than us. They don't have the same capabilities we have. But I don't think we're unique.
Jeff Hawkins, you have covered some amazing ground with us today on this really complex subject, and you lived up to your billing as someone who can tell the story with such clarity. Thank you for being such a great sport. Thank you for putting up with our technical hitches. And I do commend the book. As I said, the first book I bought for myself to read when I finished mine to readers. Any last words for the audience?
I think the only last thing I would say is I like to point out the book has got 3 parts. The first part is about the brain. We talked about the discovery. The second part is all about AI. I have some different opinions about the risk of AI, so you might be interested in that. And the third part of the book is quite philosophical, and it talks about humanity as an intelligent species and how we might view ourselves differently if we think about intelligence as the most important part of who we are, not our genes, not our biology. And I just want to put the plug in that, because I think it's one of the most forward part of the books, and it's the one that people might be most surprised to read when they read the book. But I think it's important. I think as humans we should be thinking about us as intelligent species and our role in the universe, not just here on Earth.
I'd concur with that. Jeff Hawkins, thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun. I wish I could have been there in person.
Well, next time. Thank you so much, Jeff.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.